Hello, everyone. So, last talk of the day. Who is using internationalization or needs internationalization? Okay. Oh, a lot of people. Well, that's my talk. Runtime i18n with IV. And I use IV because it's a keyword and I wanted a lot of people to come. No, it's going to be about IV. So, as I was preparing my talk 3 weeks ago, actually as I was supposed to prepare my talk and, you know, procrastinating and checking Twitter and everything, I saw this tweet from Mishko saying that Angular IV is 92% ready, but there is still a lot of work in terms of testing, documentation, and i18n. And I saw that and I was like, why? Why i18n? Damn it, I just want this shiny IV thing that everyone is talking about. And then it hit me, wait, I'm the one working on i18n. Okay, so there ought to be something that I could do about that. So I made a PR and I fixed it. So you can all thank Mishko because now IV is a little bit less ready. And I want to be one of the first to say that I'm super glad that Mishko is joining the Angular team. So you can say that he's a little bit responsible for that. Internationalization. Internationalization is something that a lot of people don't think about until it becomes really crucial for your application. If you have a company and you want to expand your business to new markets, of course a lot of people understand English. And if your application is in English, your website, they can understand. But if you want really to penetrate a new market, you need to have a localized version of your application. Internationalization takes time. And as most of you who need internationalization might have guessed, it takes a lot of time with Angular, especially because it could be a lot easier to do, and it should be a lot easier to do. And that's why I was hired by the Angular to work on the Angular, so that we can have better internationalization support inside of the framework. So let's just do a quick recap of how i18n works today without IV. So first thing that you need to do is add the i18n attribute on the outer element of the thing that you want to translate inside of your template. Then you add i18n dash something attribute for the attributes that you want to translate, for example, i18n dash title. Then you use maybe ICU Expressions. A lot of people don't know what ICU Expressions are. And they're actually really powerful for internationalization. This is an example. We support two types of ICU expression in Angular, plural expressions and select expressions. Plural will use a number and select will use a string. And you can output different text depending on the value of your variables. You can even use HTML inside of it, or bindings, or other ICU expressions, and you can go deep inside of that. But yeah. Once you're done with that, you should extract your text and translate. And i18n right now only works on your templates. And whenever you're ready, you have your translation, you merge your translation, and you build your application for each language. This is how it works today. We have your template, and the HTML parser generates HTML nodes. And then the AOT compiler generates factories. And at the same time, at build time, you load your translation. A serializer will transform xlif or xmb, xtb, depending on what you use, into i18n nodes. And we will then merge them and replace the HTML nodes by the translations. And then your app bootstraps and your view is created. You have your application in another language, and everything is great. With IV, it's a little bit different. We moved a good part of i18n to runtime. And so the last part is about the same. We generate HTML nodes and then definitions, and that's what you use to bootstrap your application. But then when the view is created, we query the translations, and those translations can be loaded at runtime or at build time, depending on what you prefer. And then the serializer generates i18n definitions, and the view will just grab those translations and apply them on your template when the view is created for the first time. So let's take a really simple template with a title that you want to translate and some text inside of a span. To add internationalization, you just add the i18n attribute and the i18n title attribute, meaning that you want to translate everything inside of the div and also the attribute on this div. And this is the code generated by Ivy. It's a little bit different than what Alex showed this morning because I use the full text version. This is what we use in the test for Angular, for example. So you have two parts. The first one is the creation part. The second one is the update part. And the element div, you can see the div, the span, text node inside of it, and the div has a title with the content header. And when the update phase runs with change detections, you will have a text binding that will put the text inside of the text nodes that were generated above. You can see that the index of text binding matches the text node over there. So we want to remove all of the text, and we just keep the skeleton of your application because all of the text will be replaced by your translation. So we just keep the skeleton, remove all of those text elements, and then we apply the i18n instructions for IV, and it looks like this. You will have one i18n attribute for all of your attributes on this div element, and then i18n start and i18n end will wrap everything inside of the element that you want to translate. And we still keep the element instruction for the span because you will need it if you have, for example, queries and stuff like that. And then in the update phase, we run this instruction called i18n exp, which will check if your binding has changed. It's similar to what was used without translations. And it will put a flag, and then when i18n apply runs, we know if we need to update the content of your template or not. And i18n apply matches as the index 2 here, which matches the i18n start above. And you can see that i18n attribute and i18n start have these message div something that are passed. And they look like this. So message div is quite similar to what you had previously. You get the attribute that you want to update and the content, the text string. And for i18n starts, you will get this pseudo code that is what is generated by the serializer when you load your translation. And you will get, you can see that the number, the indexes matches what you have in your template. So the index 3 is a span element, and then you have the text inside of it, which is hello and binding 0 in our case, which will match what we get in i18n XP below. If we check them side to side, we can see that they are quite similar, except that we replace all of the string parts of your application by i18n instructions that will query for the translation and then replace everything inside of your template when we get the translation. And all of this works at runtime, which is quite different from what we had previously, which was replacing the text at build time. So there are a few limitations to using i18n at runtime. You cannot change the nesting, meaning that in your translation you can move the placeholders like the span element, but you cannot move it outside of another element. So if you have a div with a span inside of it, you cannot move the span before the div element. And this is for queries and directives components that will use the content of your template. If we start messing around with that, then it will get really ugly. You cannot duplicate placeholders either. So if you have one span element, you can remove it in your translation, but you cannot duplicate it. And you cannot use directives or components inside of ICU expressions. Even if you can use HTML templates, it will just be regular HTML. And you can use bindings, but you cannot use directives and components inside of ICU expressions. What are the benefits? So one of the main benefits is that because you only need the translation when the view is created, it means that lazy loading of those translation becomes possible. And a lot of people think that the way we do right now, which is one build per language, is too complicated, and it requires you to change your setup, your build process, your CI, and everything. It might be hard to test also. So lazy loading the translation also means that you can run your application in dev mode and have your translation work without any build step necessary for that. But it also, I want to stress out that if lazy loading is possible, it's not the only option. You can still load your translation at build time. So you can have one bundle for all of your languages, and then when you're app bootstrapped, you need to load your translation. That's up to you how you do that. And you need to have your translation ready for your application. It also means that we can finally support libraries. If you're writing a component library and you've tried to add support for different languages, you might have seen that it was not possible to use anything from Angular for that. And now if you do a date picker or, I don't know, calendar, you need to have the days translated. You can use i18n, you just need to add the i18n attribute on your component. And when Ivy will build your library and generate the definitions, and you will ship that to NPM, people will just need to load that with your translations that you provide or that they write, and they will be able to use a localized version of your components. There are still a few drawbacks. There is a small overhead at the first template creation because we need to parse the translation in order to update the template. But this is only at the first template creation. And if you remember when we show side to side both of the template generated by Ivy with or without i18n, there is not a lot of instructions that are added for i18n compared to the original version. So there is a small overhead, but we hope that it will be minimal. And there is also, if you lazy load your translation, maybe some loading time depending on the solution that you decide to use. That's up to you. What's next? Because right now we focused on having feature parity with the existing Angular code, so we haven't added something that a lot of people are waiting for. And before we jump into that, I have to warn you. Everything beyond this slide is still theoretical. We will work on adding new features once Ivy is stable, and we are sure that everything works. Runtime service. A lot of people have been requesting over and over to be able to use translation inside of their services, their components, everywhere outside of their template. And we know that a lot of people use other libraries to do that right now because Angular doesn't provide this out of the box. So if you look at this template that we had for Ivy, I told you that i18n attributes and i18n start get these strings, message div something. I didn't tell you how they would get those strings. Well, there is this piece of code at the bottom that I didn't show you. We get this message div from two different sources. We can either get it from Closure, which is what we use at Google, or you can use this thing called i18n service, and this is not the final name. We haven't decided on it yet. Don't worry, your final code will not have extra code that you don't use for Closure or anything if you don't use it. it will all be 3 seconds away. But it also enables people outside of Google to use Clojure if they want to. So this i18n service, when you load your translation file and they go through the serializer and you get i18n definition, this service is responsible for getting those translation back. And this is exactly the same whether you're in a template or outside of a template. All you need is get with some ID or something like that, you can get the translation, and then you just apply them to a template or you apply them inside of your code. So we worked on this design, we started working on this design with Mishko, and I asked him, do you think that I can talk about any of this, even if the design is not finished? And Mishko, being all polite and everything, said, probably not. And me, being French and not really understanding English, I said, oh, great. But it's still early in the US. It's like 8 a.m. I checked on Slack, and Mishko is probably not logged in. So if you're watching this, this stream, this is the end of my talk. You can close the window now. Great. Maybe some applause, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so Igor isn't here, which is great as well. Runtime service. And remember that everything here is still theoretical. If you see something and think, well, this is not really what I want, you can still come and talk to us and we can change this. It's not too late. So this is the list of things that we think are important for this runtime service. It has to be usable everywhere. So we can use it from the template, we can use it from services, components. But let's say that you build an Angular element and you want to use i18n for that. And you want maybe your client to use this component as part of a library, and they should be able to use i18n, load the translation, everything. But then they might use something else. They might use React, Vue, or whatever. And they should be able to use the same service for the translations. So we hope that we can make a service that is separated from Angular and that you can use anywhere in your JS code. It has to be tree checkable, meaning that if you don't use it somewhere in your application and you only load this part of your application, then you shouldn't load this service and everything that comes with it. And it should support lazy loading, meaning that you should be able to load more translation as you go through your application, as you load new components. And if you decide that you only need a minimal set of translation at the beginning of your application, you should be able to do that. We will be working on some tooling for the CLI that will enable all of your code splitting to also work with i18n, but we don't have more details about that right now. It should also support multiple locales. If you ever tried to use Angular Universal with i18n, you might have noticed that it's even more difficult than than if you're only doing it for your application without server-side. So what we want to do is that this service should be able to switch from one locale to another. And I can hear you over there thinking, wait, does it mean that I can change the language of my application at runtime? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it should be able to load multiple translation files, and you should be able to output translation in one language. But we still have a few blocking points with IV, even with IV, that will prevent us from changing the language at runtime. Because when you've seen the template before, and I told you that you can delete placeholders, you can move them around. If you change the language, then we have to recreate those. or maybe move them somewhere else. And the view only runs the creation phase once. Then everything is cached, so that when you reuse those components, they are cached and really fast to use. So if we were to change the language at runtime, it means that we would have to recreate all of your views. And if you have directives, components, if you have bindings or stuff like that inside of it, it will be difficult to keep the current state of your application and just change the content, the text that you want to translate. So we've done everything that we could to make this possible. And I'm not saying that it will not be possible in the future, but we still have some work to do to make this a reality. But we are closer to that than we were before. And then it should be fully functional without compilation, meaning that you can use this service in your test. You can finally test your application in different languages easily. You can ng serve your application in another locale. And you should even be able to use it without building your application in AOT mode, so for JIT, for example. So this is the list of things that we want to enable inside of the runtime service. And hopefully everything will be possible, but maybe we will have something that will prevent us from doing some of those things. So that's why I said that it was still a designing process. This time, this is the end. Thank you.